In the 20th century, no visual artist dominated the public imagination more than Pablo Picasso.
We all know about Picasso. He's our synonym for modern artist. The irrepressible wild man who changed styles every time he changed mistresses was law unto himself.
Picasso's greatest claim to fame rested on the Cubist style of art he was credited with creating. But his fans seemed to forget that Picasso didn't invent Cubism all alone. Another, less flamboyant painter played an equally important role. His name was Georges Braque. As men, the two couldn't have been more different. But as artists, they had a great deal in common.
What Picasso and Braque had in common, most of all, was courage, a courage to throw out everything that had been done in the history of art and to come up with a radically new way of making pictures.
For 6 historic years, this unlikely duo worked together to create a new form of art and worked against each other as rivals for the same prize.
They were sort of competing for attention in this avant-garde market and scene in Paris just before the First World War.
During those years, Braque and Picasso would take a fascinating journey from obscurity to fame as they competed for artistic glory, and joined forces in a transformative partnership that was more than a collaboration. It was a collaboration cubed. In 1907, Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque were just 2 of the hundreds of young artists living in Paris and struggling to kickstart their careers. Then, a mutual friend brought Braque to Picasso's studio for the very first time. When they got there, Picasso wasn't home.
They looked around, and Braque was stimulated by what was there, and he felt this is someone who's on the same wavelength, that he was going to have a lot to say to. And in fact, Braque left a note, anticipated memories. I think with the luxury of hindsight, it's easy to say this was prophetic.
A prophecy that could only have come true in Paris, the capital of the art world. But the young Braque hadn't come here to study fine art. His provincial French father had sent Braque to the city to learn the tricks of the family trade, house painting.
Be good for the family business, and the boy would have something to fall back on because he clearly wasn't good at school, and all he really liked to do was draw, but he wasn't very good at that either. But he wanted to make art, and immediately immersed himself in becoming an artist.
By 1907, Braque had found some limited success by making paintings in an established style.
Braque had been painting in what you would have to call a Fauvist mode, that is to say with the intense color and loose way of putting paint on that Matisse had showed the way for.
He was making very beautiful pictures, and there's no reason to think that he would have changed dramatically if he hadn't encountered Picasso and his work.
Picasso was born and raised in Spain in a family of painters. From an early age, he was hailed as a boy wonder, a young prodigy making works equal to any adult artist when he was barely into his teens.
And then he got to Paris, and he had this serious shock to his system when he realized, in my opinion, that everything he knew about art was out of date. He had experimented with almost every style that you could find. He'd been trained as an academic painter. He'd experimented with Impressionism. He made pictures that looked just like Toulouse-Lautrec. He was all over the map. He had his first show in Paris very early on, in 1901 or 1902, and everyone said, look at this remarkable, young, romantic Spaniard who can do whatever he wants. But the fact is, he didn't yet have a personal style, and he went from that first success to several years of absolutely grinding poverty.
When Braque returned to Picasso's studio and finally met the young Spaniard, they discovered they had a great deal in common: ambition, disappointment with their stalled careers, and a fascination with Paul Cézanne, the 19th century's last great modern artist.
Certainly they were looking at Cézanne's pictures, and they saw that in late Cézanne that the form began to dissolve in a set of small brushstrokes. They found that compelling. They knew that Cézanne's work was good, that other people admired it. They wanted to emulate it. They didn't want to do precisely what he did.
Inspired in part by Cézanne's large paintings of nude bathers, the frustrated Picasso decided to stake his future on one daring and provocative painting that could make or break his reputation. He called it Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
I think the starting point for the Demoiselles d'Avignon was a kind of dare or challenge that Picasso set himself. Picasso realized he had to do something really bold and dramatic, so he decided to make this big, ambitious picture, and it was going to have a challenging, very modern theme. It was going to be a brothel that would have a lot of big, nude figures confronting the viewer. So then he started looking for a new style, and he looked at all kinds of things, non-Western art, and he looked at Greek vases in the Louvre Museum, and this inspired him to break his figures up into geometric forms, to make them have limbs that looked like little bits of bananas stuck together, triangles like somebody's shield. And then he put in jagged hatching that maybe was inspired by African art, so it got much more aggressive.
But Picasso's aggressively original painting didn't bring him the acclaim he longed for. It brought him nothing but grief.
Now the funny thing is that we now regard this as one of the great masterpieces of 20th century art. But at the time it was finished, it was actually kind of a failure. Everybody hated it. Picasso's picture dealer hated it, his supporters hated it.
It's phenomenal. It still has the capacity to shock. It made Matisse sick when he saw it.
Braque's response to the Demoiselles d'Avignon was strangely ambiguous. He said, it's as though he wanted to make us drink kerosene. And it's not quite clear whether Braque meant that as a good thing or a bad thing. Clearly he thought it was a difficult painting, but maybe he thought it was something that was exciting. Whereas other people in their circle were just dismayed. André Derain, who was a very close friend of both Picasso and Braque, said, poor Pablo, they're going to find him hung behind his painting someday. He's going to hang himself in despair.
But instead of giving up, Picasso started right in on another painting he called Three Women. He finished it in 1908.
And that picture did everything he had hoped. That was recognized immediately as a totally new kind of picture, and all the people who had hated the Demoiselles turned around and said, now this is a masterpiece.
A masterpiece snapped up by American writer and art collector Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo. The Steins were at the center of Paris's avant-garde scene during these crucial years. Their approval put Picasso on the map.
And within a few months and then a few years, painters all over the world changed the way they made their own pictures. Everybody came through the Steins' living room, they took one look at this and they said, that's it. That's the new way to make art.
What impressed people the most was the way Picasso used a web-like structure of lines to bind his figures together and tie them to both their background and the surface of the canvas.
That, I think, was the exciting discovery, that it was a new way of tying pictures together. And Braque sat right up and went, this is amazing.
Picasso's breakthrough inspired Braque to make a breakthrough of his own, a group of landscapes painted in the south of France that were unlike anything anyone, including Picasso, had ever done before.
It's almost as though you're looking at the picture through a kaleidoscope, so everything is broken up into little geometric fragments, or it's coming apart around these diagonal fault lines.
With these kaleidoscopic landscapes, Braque built on Cézanne's legacy and Picasso's innovations to create something entirely original, and earned their new movement a name.
Matisse said, hey, Braque is painting with little cubes, and a critic picked up on this and said, Braque is painting cubic pictures, and this is where the word cubism actually comes from. It comes from that review in the fall of 1908.
The use of the word in a rather derogatory way in the review is often quoted. What's not often quoted is the next line, which is, but, Monsieur Braque is young and he's full of talent, and let's give him time.
Braque had made an impact on the critics and proved that he was ready to engage his new friend Picasso as an equal.
At first, I think Braque responded to Picasso somewhat in isolation, and it was a one-way influence. But within a year or so, sometime in 1909, they started talking to each other, and they started going back and forth and visiting each other's studios until it became a kind of close working relationship. And both of them went on record as saying, I had to see what the other guy was doing. I would always end up the day at the other guy's studio so we could check out what we'd been up to.
No one who saw Braque and Picasso running back and forth between their studios could have guessed what these brilliant young artists were really up to. All they saw were two inseparable friends out for a good time.
Picasso was fascinated by all kinds of American popular culture, Wild Bill Cody and Buffalo Bill and all that sort of thing. So he and Braque would go to see these Wild West shows, and then they pretended that they were like cowboys, and they'd call each other, "Hey, pardner." And so we have these little records of them saying "pard" to each other.
But once they got back to their studios, the playful young pards got down to work. Collectors were buying their art. Other painters were imitating their style. Now it was up to them to figure out whether Cubism was really a roadmap to a whole new realm of art, or just a dead end.
They must have felt tremendously isolated. It was just the two of them making a kind of art that no one had ever done before, and there was no way for them to know whether it was really valid, whether it really made any sense. In retrospect, we think of this as a great accomplishment, and obviously that was the case, but of course they didn't know that when they were doing it.
They described the experience as being roped together like mountain climbers as they scaled the peaks of what became Cubism. It was an adventure, it was dangerous, but neither one of them did it without the other.
It would take Braque and Picasso months of working, talking, and arguing to figure out what Cubism could be and how to make it work. Each would bring something to the collaboration that the other needed.
Braque gave Picasso a set of ideas about how to finish a picture, how to pull it together, how to make it work as a picture, whereas Picasso gave Braque a lot of ideas about how to break things up, how to redefine the human figure, how to reinvent objects.
Picasso and Braque were taking Cubism to a whole new level.
Cubism was the first art that threw out the idea of reproducing the world as you found it and tried to make it over again from the bottom up, to have a man-made structure, geometric forms, free-floating colors and textures, and to construct something totally new that somehow gave you an image of reality without looking anything like it.
They ultimately become a game about reality and representation. What we have is a form that has been taken apart in the mind of the artist and reassembled on the canvas, but somewhat askew. And one can begin to see a figure coalescing there. And perhaps because I have to work to make that figure coalesce, that makes the picture more compelling than if it had all been explained for me.
By 1910, Braque and Picasso had laid out the blueprint for Cubism's trademark style. This would become known as analytic Cubism, because of the ways the artists carefully analyzed the objects they were depicting in order to break them apart. By 1911, the young collaborators were creating works so similar that sometimes even they claimed they couldn't tell them apart.
It is clearly a joint effort, and if you look carefully at the dates of who did what when, Picasso was not the leader. He was sometimes a follower. Braque was not only an equal partner, he was the one who led the way.
In 1912, Braque led the way to Cubism's next big breakthrough. And in a move typical of the rivalry that defined their friendship, he made sure Picasso wasn't around to share the glory.
In 1911, Braque had introduced new innovations like stenciled lettering. And the following summer, when the two of them were down in the south of France together, he saw a roll of printed wood-grained paper in a storefront. And he seems to have thought to himself, hey, this is really cool. I could do something with this. But he knew that if he bought the paper and took it back to his studio, Picasso would see it that night. And Picasso being Picasso and moving so fast, Picasso was just going to steal the idea and do something with it before Braque could. So Braque deliberately waited until Picasso went back to Paris for a week. And during that week, Braque rushes into town, goes to the store, buys this wood-grain wallpaper, and starts making pictures using it. And then when Picasso comes back, he says, my God, George, that's brilliant, and picks up on the idea. But Braque, by now, clearly has priority. It's his invention, and we call this, if not collage, we call it papier-collé, glued papers.
Picasso immediately leapt into his own experiments with papier-collé, but he couldn't forget that Braque had invented it on his own. He declared his intent to beat Braque at his own game by finishing off his very first papier-collé with the words, "The battle is engaged."
And that's typical of his relationship to Braque, both friend, colleague, pard, and rival. And that rivalry was part of it. Each one got pushed into something he might not have done otherwise.
For both Picasso and Braque, the invention of papier-collé proved to be a major turning point. It would steer them away from the fractured distortions of analytic cubism and launch them into synthetic cubism, their new movement's second great phase.
Synthetic cubism, not in the sense of fake cubism, but in the sense of putting things back together again after having taken them apart in analytic cubism.
From now on, even their paintings would feature simplified shapes like the cutout paper forms of papier-collé.
This, I think, was a big move forward because it points to the radical simplification that becomes part of modern art after that. It leads towards geometric abstraction and so many different things where you can have just a few lines, just a few big colored forms, or even just black and white forms, and that's enough to make a picture.
By 1914, all of Paris seemed to be celebrating Braque and Picasso as the acclaimed masters of a whole new school of art. But the outbreak of World War I would deal their friendship a near fatal blow.
Braque was called up for military service. It was very dramatic. Picasso and Braque were down in the south of France, and Picasso saw Braque off on a train. And Picasso later said that he never saw Braque again, which was not literally true, because he did see him many, many times over the years. But I think there was the sense that an adventure, a period of intimacy had come to an end.
You know, to talk about the transformation of art is one thing, and that's, you know, how I spend my days. But there was a human disaster going on all around them that is so much more significant. There's this enormous, painful, devastating war from 1914 to 1918, with millions of Frenchmen dead.
Georges Braque would almost join their numbers. Before the war was over, he would win 2 medals for bravery shown during a battle in which he was wounded and left for dead. Braque came out of the experience a changed man.
Braque, Léger, and many other artists had been through a kind of crucible, and if they survived, they had something in common that they did not have in common with Picasso.
As a citizen of neutral Spain, Picasso didn't have to fight. While Braque was away at the front, he was back in Paris forging new relationships. Soon, they would take his life in a very different direction.
He was invited to design sets for ballets, and he got to know rich aristocrats and so forth.
He married one of the dancers. It was a disastrous marriage, but that's neither here nor there. And at that time, Monsieur and Madame Picasso were living a very elegant life.
After the war, Braque settled into a quiet, middle-class marriage with a wife he would remain devoted to for over 50 years.
Some of the tension that existed between Braque and Picasso in later years had to do with this difference in social circles.
For the rest of his life, Braque would stay home working quietly in his studio, while Picasso went out and transformed himself into one of the world's biggest celebrities. But as his fame grew, Picasso seemed less and less willing to share the credit for the invention of Cubism.
Picasso gets an awful lot more credit than he really deserves for the invention of Cubism. Part of that is that Picasso has entered the popular imagination in the way very few artists have. You know, he's someone everybody's heard of, everyone has an idea about.
I think everyone will say that Picasso was one of the titans of the 20th century, and that's because his works of art, his paintings, his sculpture, his drawings, command our attention. They command high prices. People want to own them. People will fight with one another in order to obtain them at auction. And there's a lot there. There's a lot of thinking there.
There's no way to tell the history of modern art without continually referring to Picasso. And I think it's for that reason that he does, in fact, ultimately emerge as the single most important figure.
But no honest history of the invention of Cubism can ignore the fact that Picasso couldn't have done it without Braque. And Braque's influence on modern art didn't end there.
It's something that's kind of been forgotten, what a big influence Braque had in his own right with his later work. The fact is that Braque made extraordinary paintings in the 1920s and 30s and so on, really up to the end of his career. And Braque had a sense for texture and color, for a kind of simplified drawing and harmony that's quite different from what Picasso did, and that was tremendously influential during those decades.
By the time Braque died in 1963, it seemed as though only his fellow Frenchmen were willing to give him the credit he deserved for the creation of Cubism.
Braque really became a national monument at the end of his life. He had a state funeral. Picasso didn't. Picasso wasn't a French citizen. The Minister of Culture, the enormously influential André Malraux, delivered the funeral oration in the Cour Carrée of the Louvre. Now that's an honor.
For Picasso, the honors would continue to pile up for 10 more years. But right up until his death in 1973, the time he spent with Georges Braque in Paris, playing, fighting, and making art, would remain the turning point of his career.
One of the things that was in the news a lot while Picasso and Braque were inventing Cubism was the feats of the Wright brothers, who had just made the first powered flight. And I think it occurred to Picasso and Braque that they too were great inventors and explorers, and they started calling each other Wilbur and Orville.
Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso knew they had taken painting higher and farther than ever before. Together, they had transformed modern art.
You have to look at the work side by side that was produced in this most fertile period to realize how helpful they were to each other. And that's the important thing. I don't think either one of them would have done what they did, what we now call Cubism, without the pressure and the stimulus and the help from the other.